Good evening. It's April 18th, 2014. My name is Matthew Ogden, and you're joining us for our weekly webcast with Mr. Lyndon Larouche. I'm joined in the studio by Megan Beats from the LaRouche PAC Basement Science team today, and we have a series of questions for Lynn. So let me begin with our so-called institutional question for the evening, which reads as follows. Mr. Larouche, both the G20 and the IMF World Bank just completed their annual spring meetings in Washington. With the sole exception of an unusually critical G20 communique criticizing President Obama and the U.S. Congress for failing to ratify the IMF Reform Treaty, the public performance of these institutions was largely a whitewash. You have warned that the transatlantic financial system is in an endgame breakdown. You have contrasted the real economic growth in the Asia-Pacific region with the economic breakdown process accelerating in the transatlantic region. You have also warned that the U.S. and European adoption of a bail-in policy is a clear sign that the end is near for the banking systems of Europe and the Americas. In light of this, can you give us your overall appraisal of the current state of the global economy?
Well, the best way to talk about the past is to talk about the future. Now, most people can't do that because they are not trained to do that. They don't believe in the future. And I can, of course, again, on many occasions, suitable occasions, we say, I can always present that case that the assumption that you know the truths because you have made a deductive extrapolation on the basis of the present is a great piece of idiocy which causes most people to become utterly incompetent in understanding strategic matters. In other words, the presumption by many people you cannot know the future is a piece of idiocy. A person who cannot know the future should not be allowed out off a leash because they don't know what they're talking about. If you do not know the future, I will come probably later this evening on this occasion, I'll probably refer to this particular matter. It's extremely important. And but the point is, what we have now is we have an intention which is based on the bail-in cycle. That is the attempt to run a hyperinflationary operation, which has been going on essentially since the introduction of the young Bush Cheney government, and since the launching of 9/11, which was done under the auspices of Dick Cheney. Bush was too stupid to know what was going on, so they just put him around in a plane and took him out to Idaho, and so forth, and hid him out there, and brought him back in. But he was really a dupe. So Cheney actually ran that operation of the 9/11 operation. And sooner or later, that connection of Cheney to 9/11 and the fact that he was the one who initiated the cover-up of the British-Saudi operation of doing 9/11 against the United States. Now that is going to come into some examination because of the conflict now that the president is involved in, and his CIA chief are involved in things now, and a lot of things can break loose suddenly because this is a hot potato, we might say. So what we're dealing with now is the fact that you're going into a 9/11 operation. From the 9/11 operation, you're going now into this new operation now, which is in Europe. Now, this is not going to last too long. And the setback for the attempts in Europe to push back Russia has failed. It failed because the next step would be if you tried to push it, you wouldn't know what you were pushing into. Because Russia is a very capable nation in that whole area. And unless you bring the British Empire in directly, and that's a global empire, then you cannot deal with this thing the way they're trying to deal with it. So that was what the setback, the Geneva meeting and so forth, was a setback on the fact you can no longer continue to call this kind of pushing, which Obama and his CIA chief are doing. And that is going to backfire in several different ways. But that doesn't mean the problem is over. It means the problem has shifted from a regional conflict, that is Russia and the transatlantic region, is now going into a global thing, if it goes anywhere further. So now you're at a point where you can go essentially in two directions. You can go either to a thermonuclear war on a global scale, which would mean the British Empire would come in openly and directly on top of it, together with the United States. With the problem that now that you have in the United States government with the Obama operation, together with the CIA operation, this induces more complications, which go back and forth. But the general thing is either Obama is going to be thrown out, hopefully soon, thrown out of office, and justly so, or we don't know where we're going, and anything could happen. So that's what we have in now. And the bail-in process means that you're in a short fuse. The British Empire is the center of this thing. And the British Empire is not the United Kingdom. The British Empire is the entire empire of Her Majesty the Queen. That's the empire. And it controls the greatest part of the globe. Is controlled by the British Empire. That's the enemy. That's our enemy. It's the British Empire. And that's a real problem for some people in Russia because they're a little bit soft. Some Russians are very soft on the British and prefer to attack the United States without having to attack the British. Because Russia was divided between two actions under the Soviet Union. One was a pro-British action based on Bertrand Russell, and the other was the opposite view. So there are complications all over this thing. But in general, we're in an endgame situation. And because of the bail-in factor, you cannot prolong this much longer. So soon, Obama has to be thrown out of office. That would be a solution, because there would be probably no war at all to speak of if Obama was thrown out of office. He's extremely unpopular. He's committed crimes. He's hated. And there are many other things we could talk about on this subject. But the issue now is for the moment, the fact that Russia can handle the European situation as it stands now. Therefore, you had the agreement to back down, back off. No more pushing Russia this way. And but then the point is that doesn't end it, because the British Empire has a problem. If they don't get their way, the British Empire is going to go bankrupt. So we have, in a sense, very clear indications and some indications of what the future is bringing down upon this situation, but we don't have any definite conclusions. We have very clear indication of what the options are. We don't know what the choice of the options is going to be, and that we'll have to find out.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question on some of the themes you just brought up. At the beginning of the week, you were interviewed on Russian state media, the state news service RIA Novosti. And this interview, which appeared the same day that Chinese national television, CCTV, aired their interview that they had done with your wife, Helga Tsepp-LaRouche, on their very prominent dialogue program. And I think the simultaneous broadcast of these two interviews in China and in Russia really shows how closely both of these governments are following your analysis and your leadership. In your interview with RIA Novosti, they played up your warnings that the intention of the Ukraine operations is not a limited European theater war or something localized to Ukraine, but that this is intended to be a global thermonuclear World War III. And you emphasize that the events in Ukraine can only be understood in tandem with the current escalations that are now happening in China. You've got Hagel was just there threatening, a parallel operation as what you saw in Crimea, and claiming that this is what China was planning. And you also have now Obama preparing a trip next week to the Asia Pacific to try to whip up Japan and try to whip up the Asia pivot, so-called. So that these events are merely provocations in the region, and that they have to be seen as a prelude, as the preparation for a global thermonuclear war by Obama, who's merely a stooge of the British Empire, and that by impeaching Obama, this whole operation would break down. Now, we also saw, as you mentioned, John Brennan showing up in Kiev, in Russia in Ukraine at the beginning of the week. Now, all of these are being driven, as you've repeatedly emphasized, by the bail-in collapse. And your point in your most recent paper that I got to look at was that you've got a contradiction between two alternative systems, two mutually opposing systems. One is being driven by energy flux density on a constant increase, a commitment to that at least in the Asia-Pacific region, and one is being driven by an intention towards a downward devolution of the energy flux density available in the transatlantic system. What I'd like you to develop more on is what you just mentioned about why is it that there is a tendency in Russia and in other places to miss the point about the British Empire and to instead attack the United States as so-called American imperialism, rather than realizing that you've got a single enemy which has gone on record with a Zeusian intention calling for this depopulation and this enforced collapse in the energy density.
Well, this involves some complications. You have to go back to the beginning of the 1900s. And at that point was a turning point. The point was to eliminate science. And that started there with in France, with the case of Hilbert. Hilbert began a process of canceling the use of science, physical science, and said, now we're going to use arithmetic rather than science. Now, Hilbert was not too good at the job. He started the thing, but he didn't know exactly what he was doing. So along came about a decade later, by the time Bertrand Russell had come in. And Bertrand Russell took over the same policy. So since the beginning of the 20th century, exactly on that date of the 20th century, you've had the destruction of science. So what the result is that the long trend since then, since Hilbert and then Russell, you have no scientific practice is encouraged. With the assassination of John F. Kennedy, there was no progress, further progress in economy in the United States. There has been no progress in physical economy in the United States in terms of net effect since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Now, the factor in there was, of course, the Indochina War. And the Indochina War was a factor which, in a sense, pushed that. But from the beginning, for the 1920s on, there was no net growth of the economy of the United States anywhere. The same kind of process was spread throughout the entire century into the early part of this new century. So that there has been no physical economic growth in terms per capita in the entire Eurasian, not the Eurasian, but rather the transatlantic region. No net growth has occurred in the transatlantic region since this phenomenon. And the turning point was actually the Indochina War, in which we were involved, and it came on the heels of the actual decision point was to cancel progress in the United States by the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So that's where we are. Now, so therefore, if you want to understand the economy in the or the transatlantic region in particular, there has been no net growth in the physical economy of the transatlantic region since the end of that period, since the beginning of the 1970s. No net growth. Now, that's what you're seeing. Now, the driver for this process is the fact that you eliminate every bit of actual physical principles. For example, we have people in the United States today who are generally older people, older scientists, who are kept on the shelf. They're no longer allowed to actually conduct physical scientific work. They can sit there and talk about it, write their memoirs, talk about what they might have been able to do if they'd been permitted to do it, all these kinds of things. There has been no actual net progress in the United States in terms of net technology. All right, this has then occurred with the destruction of what had existed as previously established technology. So now you have, if you look at the loss in the labor force, we no longer have a productive labor force inside the United States. It does not exist. What we have is we're drawing down from the refuse, like recharging the refuse. And that's our production process. We are now in the process of mass killing of the U.S. population. It's done systematically. You have a mass killing process in Europe as well. You have throughout much of the planet. So you have a relative growth in some parts of the Asian sector, or the trans-Asian, trans-Pacific section, where there is some progress. But in general, there is no net progress of the conditions of mankind in the transatlantic region and in many other parts of the planet. There is no scientific technology in most parts of the transatlantic region. None. They all, what they call science, what is listed as science, is nothing but arithmetic. So they use arithmetic formulas. Now, arithmetic formulas has no net gain in it. And no matter how clever you try to be with a mathematical formula, you never actually introduce a physical gain in productivity. Now you see that is happening all throughout relevant features of the planet. You see it in Russia. Russia is a case of how Russia was destroyed. There are many explanations of that, but no, I know what more the explanations are. And so that's where we stand. Now, this goes into another matter. And let me just refer to it because it does help to clarify things. I have this on hand in case it came up as a necessary point. All right, let me just read this off just as I said it. I'm referring to this problem of the collapse of the economy. I say, there is an actual remedy for such errors of the past. The answer lies in the nature of the purpose of mankind's having existed as a species of a special nature, specific nature. The progress of the human species from the failures of the past to the immortality of the future mankind, which actually progresses. In other words, mankind, the nature of mankind's existence, mankind is the only species which does and must increase its energy flux density efficiency. In other words, you're always going to a higher order of energy flux density. Now, this takes the form of going to chemistry. And arithmetic and chemistry are two different subjects. Arithmetic is of no use in growth. It's merely carrying out the garbage, which may be useful, but it's not growth. In fact, the growth is not very nice. So the point is that you have the human species has now been put, coincident with what happened with the shutting down of science in the year 2000, 1900 rather. So since that point, we no longer have an increase in the productive powers of labor in the transatlantic region. Oh, there are some episodic features, but it never stuck. much of the stuff was driven by war. That is, fighting wars you would organize and bring back some applied technology or some enhanced technology, and you would use it for warfare purposes. But that did not work too well in terms of a net effect. So that's what's happened to us. Now, this became, as I say, worse. The crucial turning point was the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And that, immediately followed by the Indochina War, is what destroyed the United States. The drug traffic, all of this kind of crap, this is what did it. So what you have now is you have a human species whose existence depends upon increase of the energy flux density of human activity, as reflected by the application of chemistry. We're going to higher orders of energy flux density through chemistry. So science is generally related to chemistry, either directly or implicitly. And that is what's been destroyed. So now we've gotten to another stage. So this characteristic of mankind, to increase the energy flux density of mankind through chemistry. And chemistry means, for example, mankind is the only species that voluntarily uses fire as a means of existence. And fire is the form of the increase of the energy flux density through chemistry. And the steering of growth through chemistry. That is, the chemistry, growth and chemistry are related in this respect. So we've gone in an opposite direction. Now, the characteristic of mankind and mankind's existence depends entirely on increasing the energy flux density of the performance of the population through the magic of chemistry, in the most general sense of chemistry. So chemistry and mankind are closely related. Now, no animal species can do it. No animal species voluntarily uses fire. And fire is simply an expression of what we call chemistry, the increase of the energy flux density of the chemical process, or the biochemical process. And when you get to Vernadsky and his work on life, you now are at the core of what the real meaning of chemistry is. It is not chemistry in simply the vulgar term, it's chemistry as mankind and mankind's ability defines chemistry through the use of fire, through the principle of chemistry. So what happens now, we have a species which now says we are not going to have growth. We're fracking instead. Which means that mankind is in danger of extermination, self-extermination, because of this process. And so what does that mean? It means that the goal, the political and moral goal in the United States today is to what? Is to actually go against human growth, against human progress. Genocide against the human species, the Zeusian policy, the same policy as the Roman Empire, and the same policy as the current British Empire. So the British Empire, which is a reincarnation of Zeus, the evil Zeus, the Satan of the world, is now dominating the world. And since 1900, with what happened there, we then went to hell on some kind of a carpet. We're going to hell. So we're now at a point where those who are the greenies are the enemies of the human species. They are the instruments of the enemies of the human species. The green policy in the United States is a pro-genocidal policy against the people of the United States itself. So what the whole plan of this thing was to go through a real Zeusian process to reverse progress, beginning with the year 1900, to reverse progress by eliminating physical science, eliminate chemistry, eliminate the chemistry of human life utilization of chemistry, the human mind's ability to create a higher form of fire through higher orders of chemistry. So therefore, what you have is you have the leadership of society today, such as Obama, or as Dick Cheney before him, or he's still there, right, are agents of pure evil. Obama and Cheney are instruments of pure evil set into motion by getting Bill Clinton out of office. That's how it was done, and the cancellation of Glass-Steagall. Since that time, now, the trend in society is a degeneration of the human species. We're now going through systemic genocide against the people of the transatlantic community. In the intention to spread this genocide, which is now already fully operating in full swing in the Americas, in the transatlantic region, in Europe in general. And this is evil, pure evil. So therefore, what is inevitable is that there's now a global conflict between these two forces. The forces of progress, the forces of humanity, against the forces of the satanic forces, the Zeusian forces, the forces of pure evil. And that's what our problem is. And the problem is that the average person out there has been so brainwashed, so stripped of access to technology, so reduced to helplessness, to starvation, to complete sense of personal impotence. And our problem is, which is my problem, among others, by people like me, is to say, all right, let's destroy Zeus. Let's turn things back. Let's restore science. Let's defend the human species against the satanic forces. And that, in point of fact, is the essence of the matter.
Okay, Lynn, our next question comes from Keisha Rogers, who is right now running a very important campaign in the state of Texas in a runoff election for the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate. So she asks, as you know, my campaign has been traveling across Texas, from Dallas to Beaumont to Brownsville to El Paso, sounding the alarm about Obama's insane drive to thermonuclear war. The people we meet at the organizing table usually understand this to some extent. Most recently, however, I gave a series of interviews to print and television media in El Paso. And despite my attention to this as the defining issue that subsumes how we must think and respond to all other issues, none of the published accounts included this strategic assessment. In recent discussions, you have brought up the idea of Promethean time and Zeusian time. The inability of our media to report what the population clearly has a sense of, and the inability of the population to mobilize to stop what they recognize as the extinction threat, indicates to me a stark example of what you refer to as Zeusian time. A tendency to behave as if stuck in a universe where time and space are absolute and nothing ever changes. It is our obligation to intervene with real solutions, the ones our country needs in the face of this threat. The American people must rediscover their ability to think as Prometheans and respond in accordance with the physical universe, rather than some arbitrary set of mental rules. I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, the way to understand this is you have to look at the Republican Party. I know you don't like the picture, but I got to tell you the bad truth, the ugly truth about this whole business. The intention, the Republican Party is a pack of idiots, frankly. I mean, the clinically idiots. What they're doing is they're saying, we can win the next election for president. How? We will not allow Glass-Steagall to be reenacted. Therefore, by keeping Obama in office, while he's increasingly hated by most Americans for very, very, very good reasons. They say, well, he's going to be so hated that we Republicans in the next turn for the presidential elections will win the election. And they are deliberately sabotaging Glass-Steagall efforts in order to try to promote that program. Now, the effect of that is a destructive effect on the U.S. population beyond belief. This is mass murder, but it's also Republican insanity. Any Republican who adapts that policy is clinically insane, because there will be no next election. Two things can happen on this election question, which is what the core of what Keisha's problem is and what the challenge is. You're in a situation in which you have to turn things around, or all hell is going to break loose. The factor on this is the British Empire factor. Now, the British Empire is very much a factor in all this nonsense, but it has not come out in its own name with full-blasted commitments. The next phase would mean that the British Empire would go into the arena directly in its own name. That would be a thermonuclear war, from which it's doubtful that a full panoply of the population would ever return. So that's the problem we're dealing with. Now, so therefore, what Keisha is doing, and there are other people in the United States who understand the importance of what it is she is doing. She actually represents the potential for turning the situation in the United States around from going to hell to going into a much kinder place. And she is going to get support. I think it's going to require as much effort as we can put into it. But she's in a good position in the state of Texas because of the circumstances in the state of Texas in particular. Remember that Texas is being destroyed. Whole parts of Texas that used to function don't function anymore. The cattle are going. The crops are vanishing. The productivity, except for fracking, is, and that's not productivity, it's about the only thing left there and up the northern Canadian border area. Fracking, fracking, fracking. So we've come to the point that she becomes a keystone in this process, where her winning the prospect in the coming month, her winning the election for the Senate in that debate would mean a turn in the United States political system. It would mean in particular that the Democratic Party, of which she is a spokesman, a key spokesman, a new senator of the Democratic Party in the state of Texas, her, would mean a turnabout in the national electoral pattern in many other ways as well. And that's the nice little thing that's going on. And it all goes to what we're dealing with. The only way we can solve any of these problems, and the problems that Keisha is dealing with, addressing, if we do not change the direction of the economy from going down and down into the green depths, which actually turn out to be quite brown. I don't know why they call it green, I guess because there is a color, a bit of green in the brown. But so therefore, what Keisha is doing is not acting from the past. Keisha is doing what all good leaders do. Every good leader in society campaigns to lead man into a future disposition. The idiot thinks that mankind does not know the future. Well, the idiots do not know the future. But when man knows the future, and only when man knows the future, man picks a goal which raises the possibility of mankind to advance in conditions of life as much as anything else. So what she is, don't look at her as just a person struggling. Yeah, she's a person struggling. But we're all born and we all die. So what's this all mean if we all die? Why are we fighting if we all die anyway? Well, it's because mankind is not a creature of the past. Mankind is a creature of the future. And only mankind lives in the future. No form of animal life lives in the future. Why is man? Because man is a future animal. Mankind willfully goes into states of existence which mankind himself creates. And the progress of mankind to go from lower states to higher states of development is the characteristic of the human species and is the difference. For example, someone says, your dog died. Well, yes, the dog died. And nothing will happen because the dog died. The dog will be mourned, then replaced, ignored. But the human being, no. Human beings who are ignored and just buried, they ain't nothing. They just ain't nothing. Because the importance of the human species is the importance of that each generation of the human species is able to progress, even when there are great setbacks to humanity and large wipeouts of humanity. Nonetheless, the human spirit, as we call it, brings back the creative powers of productivity which exist only within the human species. Mankind does not live for the laurels of the past. Rather, the past exists for the accomplishments of future mankind. That's human nature. And that's what she represents. That's what I represent. We are dedicated not to what came to us before we died. For dogs, for pets, for animals, that's it. There is no future for the animal. Once they're dead, they're dead. And only human beings may mourn the missing pet. But nothing will ever bring that pet back or bring a replacement to that pet back. Only in the human species and through the creative powers expressed by the human species, mankind is worth what he does to cause the future to advance. And is therefore those of us who despise the green, who despise the evil of bestiality, which is what the Republican Party is for. The Republican Party is a bestial party. And they are the living dead. They propose to win an election for president after a period where the entire system will be dead under the present policies. That is not a very intelligent progress. It's a bestial view, and I think a lot of Republicans are quite bestial in these matters. But humanity is based on the fact the importance of your life is what your living gives to the advancement of the future of mankind. This may occur as an actual net gain, or it may occur as a regain of something that had been lost by mankind in some period of man history. And that's the point. The person who is green is worthless, or less than worthless, because they will contribute nothing to the future of mankind, and therefore nobody should mourn them, but perhaps should regret that they lived at all, because they were merely something bad, something that stunk. Huh? And therefore what we represent, what we have to understand, is that mankind is an noetic species, the unique noetic species. Mankind will be able to take over more and more power in the solar system and to reach beyond. And that's the future. And we will make the future. That's what we live for, to make the future. That's what we're worth. We're worth what we contribute to making the future. And that's the difference between the human species and the beast. And the Republicans are acting like beasts. Obama is a beast.
Well, then I'd like to ask a follow-up question on the drought crisis. Now, Keisha's campaign in Texas, paired with Michael Steger's campaign for U.S. Congress in the state of California, are occurring in the two largest and potentially and historically most industrially and agriculturally productive states in the nation. Now, these are also two states which are suffering acutely as we speak from what's been a prolonged and deep drought condition. Now, you have been warning for quite some time, as early as 2011, that if immediate action is not taken to secure the U.S. food supply in the face of these disasters, that the United States would be facing conditions of hunger, with devastating price inflations for food and also food shortages in the near term. Now we've reached a point where this crisis in the food supply is here. And I'd like to just give a quick overview of the current conditions. In the state of California, which grows 1/3 of the nation's fresh produce supply, nearly 1 million acres are currently severely impacted by the immediate drought conditions. Now, a study just came out on April 16th from Arizona State University on the conditions of price inflation in food, which is expected to hit in the immediate period directly because of the current drought. Now, this study highlights an expected price rise of 13% on packaged salad products, 14% on corn, more than 20% on tomatoes and fresh broccoli, 35% on lettuce. Now, these are the price hikes which are expected in the immediate days and weeks, but there's more to come. Now, to compensate for this drop in supply, the major food cartels, such as Dole and Del Monte, are intensifying imports from poor countries who are also suffering from a lack of food and water, such as Mexico, the Dominican Republic, and Chile. Now, in the state of Texas, which has the largest cattle herd in the nation, the cattle inventory is severely low because of the prolonged drought conditions. Nationwide, the cattle herd has fallen to the lowest level in 63 years, while beef cartels continue to export and prices continue to rise. Now, the food supply is threatened not only from a collapse in production, but also because of a collapse in transport. Because of the Dick Cheney and now Obama promoted boom in fracking in places such as North Dakota and Montana, farmers are unable to move the food that they've already produced and harvested to market because the available rail cars are stuffed and monopolized for the transport of oil and natural gas. In this northern farm belt, the stocks of corn, beans, and wheat are rotting in storage bins because the rail cars for shipping are running months and months behind. In North Dakota, the bean growers require 4,000 rail cars per year to ship their harvest, but they can't get them. Instead, the oil and gas industry utilizes 36,000 rail cars per month to ship oil and natural gas. In South Dakota, more than 11,000 rail cars dedicated for the delivery of grain have been delayed, and the grain is rotting in storage with no more room to accept the coming harvest. Shipments of fertilizer necessary for the spring planting are unable to get through. Now, as you have been reiterating and said again tonight, there is no solution to the crisis unless it is based on a top-down science driver program, which is based on the highest energy flux density of thermonuclear fusion. Now, this has been embodied in the thermonuclear NWAPA policy that the LaRouche PAC has been promoting. Now, when presented with the proposal for this thermonuclear NWAPA, many respond that the proposal is wonderful, but it's not realistic, that it's not practical, even though the failure to address the crisis that I've just outlined will result in mass starvation among the American people. Now, in your one of your most recent writings, and again tonight, you state that the only standard by which the relative progress or decline of a human society can be measured is the net increase or decrease of energy flux density applied per capita, and that any culture which fails to express this willful increase in energy flux density and upward evolution will tend toward a self-extinction. So I'd like to ask you, what would you say to those who refuse to take the necessary actions today to reverse this 50-year collapse in the productive powers of our nation, and instead insist on submitting to a Zeusian agenda that they may even disagree with personally, but submit to an agenda of depopulation and the so-called green policy?
Okay. Well, it's very simple and it's ancient. It's called Satanism, which is otherwise known as Zeus. The policy, and the Satanism is the policy of the British Queen, for example, today. The British Queen has a policy which has been in effect, especially since the period of the Copenhagen events, of saying reducing the human population from 7 billion people to less than 1. And the targets are indicated to be significantly less than 1. We have now since actually seen that since the beginning of the last century, with the measures taken to substitute arithmetic for science, has caused, Bertrand Russell, of course, was the leading figure in this. He was practically the Satan of the 20th century. And he could be fairly called the true Satan of the 17th century. Maybe the real Satan was sleeping or drunk or something at the time, but he was in there to do the job. So therefore, what you have then, you say, well, now what? We have kingdoms like that. We have empires like that. The Zeusian empire is not a mythological empire. There's mythology around the existence of this culture. But it was not a mythological state. It was a mythologized form of society, an actual society. And this society is found turning up in all parts of the earth, these types. The Roman Empire, for example, is an example of that. The Roman Empire was a Zeusian system. The British Empire was modeled explicitly on the same system, on the Zeusian system, the Roman imperial system. And it was that from the beginning. They took the exact formulas of the Roman Empire and said those are the policies of the British Empire. And that's exactly what happened from about September or so forth of that year. The British Empire was dedicated to that purpose. And it occurred as a whole process of the Dutch evil of the previous century, of the latter part of the previous century. And then the Dutch again moved in. And then they created the British Empire. It was really the Dutch Empire, who had killed the Irish and so forth first as a part of their testament. And so the British and the Dutch Empire are one and the same thing. This is the relic of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire has declared itself devoted to reducing the human population from 7 billion people, estimated recently, as during the period of the Copenhagen discussions, to a deliberate intention to reduce it to less than 1. That is now happening. How is that happening? It's happening by fracking. It's happening by killing food supplies. It's a matter of starving people. It's a matter of imposing conditions which will kill them more rapidly. There's health conditions that will do that. So this is exactly what the Zeusian system has always done. That's what the Roman Empire did. The Roman Empire killed its own population and then sent them up there and began to call them Venetians at a later point. The fragments of the Roman Empire took their treasures, moved them up to the swamps in the northern part of the Adriatic, and gradually evolved a culture which we call Venice. well, known for its venery, for among other qualities. So that's what it is. So you have actually a phenomenon of actual living evil, a living satanic principle, which is embodied in the President of the United States right now. There's nothing in this president's behavior which does not correspond to a satanic view. What he's doing is satanic. But many of the Republicans are satanic. Many other strata. What happens is when the empire takes over and starts killing the people they don't like, what happens is the survivors decide they're going to join the Roman Empire and hope they can get a job. And not be eaten, but rather do some of the eating. And that's what we're in. We're in a point where you have a moral degeneration of our own population who are now living like parasites, like cannibals, on the lives of each other. And they may not actually eat their neighbors, but they certainly do the same things that would cause the eating of their neighbors to occur. And this is what we're at. So the question is, do we, who have the ability to understand history, to understand the difference between chemistry and arithmetic, which apparently most school students today don't know the difference. Most people who are educated as scientists today don't know anything about science. All they know is complicated, intertwined kinds of mathematics, exotic mathematics. They keep inventing new kinds of mathematics, but the net productivity of this mathematics production is downward. Why is it that mathematics, when applied in these forms, always results in a lower level of productivity? So you have more complicated programs and people which are less productive, which destroy productivity, and you say, this is science? This is not science. This is in science. An incest science. Right? And so so therefore we who understand this, or are able to understand it, or have the guts to understand it, have the responsibility of speaking out loud and clear as to what the truth of this whole business is. What you're having now is you're having from a Russia which is bouncing back from a lot of problems and going into Asia, which is now saying, we are not going to accept this Zeusian principle which has taken over the transatlantic region. And we in the transatlantic region have to say, we are not going to put up with this any longer. And therefore you have to get rid of Obama, get him out of the office, and put the Republicans in a cage where they can do what they want to do, but not bother us too much, and keep their fleas away from us.
Okay, I'm going to ask a final question. This question pertains to the future, and it's on the subject of what you've emphasized this week as the so-called two clocks, the Zeusian clock versus the Promethean clock. And I think what you mentioned on this earlier is that these two beliefs in a Zeusian system or a Promethean system tend to determine the predominant tendencies of behavior within the human species. You made the point that the fundamental distinction in psychology is between whether you believe in the timeline of history that has already been predetermined, so-called, and that you must accept it like a peasant, saying, you've got to be practical, you've got to be realistic, or if you reject that belief, and if you act to exert a voluntary will to change the timeline of history and overthrow the power of Zeus, like Prometheus did. I think a very good insight into the consequences of these opposing tendencies was expressed by the chairman of the Russian Duma's Foreign Affairs Committee, a gentleman named Alexei Pushkov, who delivered an interview with EIR magazine this week. And it was a long interview. He, in the interview, accused Tony Blair of being a war criminal, which is in fact true. But in the last question, he was asked about the necessity of international cooperation to defend the Earth from comets and asteroids, the so-called strategic defense of Earth, which he has previously endorsed. And I think his answer is very apropos to this question of the opposing clocks of history. He said, briefly, unfortunately, a big part of the political class of leading nations is blinded by geopolitical issues and this desire to dominate in the world. When I said that nations should be working together to defend the Earth from asteroids and comets, this is something that seems to be a distant danger. But in fact, if you look at the scientific data of the last 10 years, you will see that on 2 or 3 occasions, very big asteroids passed at a distance which by cosmic space measures is just a hair's breadth from the Earth, something like 300 million kilometers. It's almost nothing. A slight shift somewhere, and they would hit us. And then, nothing would be important. It would not be important whether Mrs. Hillary Clinton will be the next president of the United States or not. It will not be important what Mr. Robert Kagan thinks in Washington and what the United States thinks about the reunification of Russia with Crimea. All of a sudden, things would get their, I would say, real value. And the real value will tell us that we have missed a huge opportunity to defend ourselves from absolute evil. So he concludes saying, so I think that these false goals are something which is blinding the American political class. All of a sudden, we will see that all of this is not important, what's being debated now in the United States. What is important is to survive as humanity. And unfortunately, I'm afraid we're much closer to this than we think, and nothing is being done. There is no program for using the Earth's missile potential and nuclear potential to fight asteroids. It's as if this problem does not exist. But of course, there's a program costing billions and billions of dollars to establish an ABM system to try to neutralize the Russian nuclear potential. So he ends by asking a question which I sort of want to pose to you. He says, what is this about? What is this? Blindness? Lack of understanding? Or just a self-serving image of power, might, that people fool themselves with? I'm afraid that something will happen that will show us the relativity of these geopolitical goals, which are being set and promoted as the most important thing in the world. I think that there are other things that are more important, and if we don't understand it ourselves, the course of events will show us that we were wrong. So I think this situates these two opposing clocks, the Zeusian clock versus the Promethean clock.
Well, let's start with the case of human cannibals. Let's talk about the fertility of family households in terms of child breeding. Well, what happens is generally is that you have societies which are progressive actually are more fruitful in terms of births, more fruitful in terms of productivity, more fruitful in developing vegetables, and so forth. So therefore what happens is the difference between man and beast is what's crucial here. The beasts actually do a little bit better than the greenies do in this account. The beasts don't know any better, but the difference is the human species is a noetic species intrinsically. That is, in our natural state, we make discoveries. We go to higher orders of chemistry, in effect. I mean, the difference between mankind and the ape is mankind cooks his food. Apes do not. And so we try to avoid monkey business in the human species. Now you will find that in the case where you don't have that standard, where you do not breed to have more human beings because you want to be able to be more productive, you will find that you have things happen like the importance of keeping a child alive, of nourishing the child, of having more children, because that's how you increase your productivity. If you increase the number of children who are going to become productive, You're going to have more production, aren't you? By doing that. They're going to get skills. They're going to do things that would not otherwise happen. So in a society, a civilized society, the increase of the productivity, now there's a limit to how many children you should have. I mean, after all, a woman can only carry so much at one time. But you know, the point is the question of optimism as opposed to the cannibal. The cannibal eats the excess children and the excess adults if they can catch them. And you see what happens in the Queen of England. What's she doing? She's saying she's going to reduce the human population from 7 billion people on this planet to less than 1. She's a cannibal, in effect. She's saying there are too many people. She's saying the people who are skilled, there are too many of them. Ignorant, stupid people are preferred. What's happening in our own country? What's happening to the conditions of life of the typical person, the household in the United States? What is this but virtual cannibalism or economically cannibalism? And therefore there's a difference, a fundamental difference between the rate of not only of birth incidence, is also rate in the increase of the productive powers of labor. And the characteristic of mankind, which makes mankind, is the increase, the voluntary increase of the productive powers of labor, which involves what we call technology, or in a more general sense, science. Therefore, the patterns are that the purpose of existence is different. They're still, both are apparently biologically human beings, but they don't function the same way. Their characteristics of birth, their characteristics of population are different, opposed. The Roman Empire used up people, as in the Colosseum, a thing that Obama would very much like to do, for example, to claim himself to be to that. Whereas the human being who is creative. Now, what do we say? Well, we say that people who don't accept progress are not fit to be eaten. Means we don't want to eat them, but we don't want to support them because they're not really human in their behavior. And so therefore you will get characteristic changes. For example, let's take the peasantry, the serf-like peasantry, or similar kinds of phenomena, social phenomena. Right? How productive are they? What about the Russian peasant? Same thing. So therefore, the voluntary characteristics of the productive tendency is what determines the birth patterns, the characteristics of the population. Now, as you take the case of what we have to deal with asteroids. Well, you would think that a human species which was productive would realize that the asteroid phenomenon is a very significant one. And we would be spending a lot of effort to do something about that. Well, that effort would mean reversing the hill bear policy, getting away from arithmetic, the number game of arithmetic, and going to what? To physical science, scientific progress. So the fundamental difference is absolutely characteristic. It's as if the Republicans were beasts, and the good Democrats are human, something like that. And that's how the thing determines it. But the point is, it has the effect of a physical effect. It's like a physical difference in the behavior of the populations. They behave like beasts, or they don't. And therefore, the impulse the cultural impulse is built in, is the sense of worth. What is a farmer? Say the progressive farmer. The progressive farmer thought of the increase of worth in terms of the increase of children. By educating and developing children, by giving them skills and getting tools for them that they couldn't have before, developing the land areas, in making society richer in terms of human existence. This is normal. So once you get these attitudes, once you want to become a drunk, a whoremaster, so whatever that is, you begin to behave like that. And you will have the population characteristics of the whoremasters. And that's exactly what it is. It's the same with the Roman Empire. How did the Roman Empire destroy itself? You know, you had this thing, the Roman Empire was destroying itself, and then the richest people of the Roman Empire skedaddled, took their treasures, went up to the northern part of the Adriatic, lived for a long time in the swamps of the Adriatic, and then finally built up Venice. And it was called Venice, and I say means venery, I suppose. But in any case, the characteristics, the social characteristics of societies are not simply social habits. They're an organic part of the behavior of the human species. And the human species, which is a voluntary species, voluntarily selects its characteristics as a population. You assume that it's a biological determination. Well, it's biological in a certain sense, but you can't separate biology from human behavior. So therefore, the development of a biology for a human species is the determination of a willful determination of characteristics. And those characteristics are then built into like an educational system. And therefore you recognize when you get people who are bred to behave like that, to behave like these depraved people, you abhor them because they're a danger to you. If they're in your neighborhood, they're going to behave like people in those neighborhoods. You don't like it. You have a different standard. So it's not biologically determined. It's not some mechanical device. All human behavior is essentially voluntary. It's not biological. Yes, it's biological, but it's social. That's the difference between mankind and an animal. Human behavior is determined by human behavior, not animal behavior. We are not animals. Unfortunately, we have too many politicians who behave like animals. But it's that simple. There's a lot more to it I could go into. I have a whole agenda here. I could go into this thing for weeks to come without stopping because I'm full of it here. I've got a full agenda. But this is the reality. And we have to have a very cold-blooded attitude about this. We have to realize there are some people who are morally degenerates. Now, we don't like to have them stay moral degenerates, but it's tough to get them quitting the habit. And therefore, we have to assert our own standards. We don't want our children to be drug addicts. We don't want them to become depraved. We don't want to have cities which are marks of depravity. We don't want this crap. We don't want this disease. And it's a matter of human behavior. We want a standard of human behavior that corresponds to the requirements of the human species. And our job is to make sure that mankind has that right. I mean, all these creeps who talk about, well, they have a right to do that. They have a right to believe that. Well, let's judge what the effect is of that right as practice. What has been the effect? The destruction of the United States. The destruction of the conditions of life of the people of the United States have been destroyed by condoning practices which become socialized, which then destroy the possibility of the existence of mankind. No, there is such thing as a moral, but it's not abstract morals. It's not something, I want to believe that or I want to believe this. It's not radical choices. It's a recognition in a certain way through a biologically influenced interaction of mankind with the human mind reacting with the circumstances of life. And these things tend to readily show people the opportunity to improve their productivity, to improve the way they live. And that's what the problem is. So therefore, the so-called freedom that people demand today for have drugs, to be drugged, to be doped up, to be filled up with sex diseases, whatever they get sucked up with it. This is not a right, because we have to live under a higher sense of what the meaning of law is for human beings. You need a system of law, in effect, is a social practice which actually guides man to conduct his behavior in such a way that mankind is able to survive. Then you say, well, you want to talk about the Russian comment on this thing. It was the same thing. What the hell are we doing when we are faced with the fact of the extinction of the human species, which is, particularly in northern parts of Siberia where this thing is more likely often. And we sit there and we say, that's not important. We can't do that. In other words, a nullification of the very meaning of the existence, the nullification of the right and ability of the human species to exist. This is insanity. This is criminal insanity. Because you're bringing in the question of the existence of the human species by condoning this kind of sick corruption. Huh?
Well, that is going to bring a conclusion to our broadcast tonight. Thank you very much, Lynn. And thanks for joining us here, Megan. I would ask you to stay tuned to LaRouchePAC.com. A lot will be happening over the coming days and weeks, and we appreciate your activism. Thank you for joining us tonight. Stay tuned.